Uh, I think this is recording. Good evening or good morning. I'm going to read the psalm for Wednesday morning because I'm assuming most of you will probably watch the psalm. It's from Psalm 119. Let thy loving kindness come also to me, Lord, even your salvation according to your word. So I will make answer to my accusers, for my trust is in your word. O take not the word of your truth utterly out of my mouth. Hope is in your judgment. For I will always keep your law. Yes, forever and ever. I will walk at liberty. I will seek your commandments. I will speak of your testimonies also, even before kings, and not be ashamed. And my delight will be in your commandments, which I have loved. My hands also I will lift up your commandments, which I have loved, and my study will always be in your statutes. Lord. So welcome to the new sort of online format. My intention is to probably do two of these recorded lectures a week, and then try to meet asynchronously once a week, or synchronously once a week, so that we can sort of have a discussion. Although if you can't be there for work or whatever reasons, you'll be able to just watch the recording of it, and I'll continue to post the recordings of it. The goal for today is to cover a pretty shockingly large swath of time. I sort of sat down and mapped out the rest of the semester and realized how far behind I've gotten. So I think this is would ideally be about a week and a half worth of content sort of pushed together, and I'm going to try to get as rapidly as I can to the 20th century toward content that's usually more familiar with you. But the idea here are to think about two competing stories of late 19th century American history to give you helpful ways to organize this portion of America's history. And the organizing quote I'd like to use is this line by Richard Hofstadter. He's a famous historian of America, probably the best historian of America writing in the 50s. He says, America was born in the country and moved to the city. And so there's a tension in those two ideas. America is a rural place. It's a place that's born on the frontier. And yet this is the period when America gives up on her frontier idea and moves into the city. So what do you want to focus on? Do you want to focus on America's rural kind of idyllic birthplace, or do you want to focus on adolescents moving to the city, becoming a more mature, modern, dominant power? And these are the two themes that will kind of tell these stories. The story that you get from the historian, who is it? Frederick Jackson Turner gives you the story of the frontier. And then most of the historians, including Hofstadter, are going to talk about the city as the place where it happened. A bit of context, though, because it's kind of a few days since we last talked, is that to put this kind of, each of these stories happens in the aftermath of the Civil War. So while 20th century historians like Buffalo Bill or on Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill, of cowboys and robber barons as the story of American history. The people who lived in early mid-American history, the Civil War is the defining part of it, right? So the three kind of themes that we talked about amidst our Civil War lectures are still themes for us today. So the first would be, why did the North fight, win the Civil War? Well, the defining issue was this slogan, free soil, free labor, free men. That the victory of the North over the South was a victory for a free homesteading West over a Dred Scott vision West. It was a victory for kind of the laboring, working, mechanical classes against a vision of slave driven agricultural economy. And it was a vision of freedom, of autonomy over kind of tradition and aristocracy. And the nation is going to move forward aggressively in that pattern, not in the pattern of more traditional societies that still embraced aristocracy, especially parts of Latin America or parts of Southern Africa. The second Civil War theme is a lesson learned in the war, is the lesson of realism. That ideas are not necessarily soluble, or intellectual disputes are not necessarily soluble with the Bible or with philosophical disputation. And if the war taught the soldiers anything, it might be that the best, whether Holmes really comes to this conclusion. Officer in the war, intellectual Chief Justice. Holmes says in the late 19th century that certitude is an illusion, that you can't be certain of things. The only thing that's really for certain in life is the Darwinian struggle for existence. That is a realist. That's someone who sort of learned maybe the wrong lesson. So, and the third is a kind of an economic policy question we talked about during the war lectures. It's a victory for a Hamiltonian vision of America, maybe over a Jeffersonian victory itself. The North is going to develop in an industrial, liberal, democratic direction. And so the nation moves aggressively toward those particular ends. But this tension, this question of the frontier or the city, I think really is a helpful way to organize our conversation today. Is America more kind of shaped by the rural, kind of rugged frontier where individuals kind of create their own destiny, as Frederick Jackson Turner suggests? Is this where democracy is born? Or is America born from the unbridled capitalistic desire for profit, desire for self-interest, is the almighty dollar sort of the vision? And the way that you're going to answer this, a lot to sort of depend on where you are. When I studied at Houghton 20 years ago, I think we were much more taken with stories of the frontier because Houghton is such a rural place. And then when I went to the University of Maryland in this bustling metropolis, this Washington, D.C., students were very much more taken by an urban sort of metropolis story. And then when I was in Idaho again, so these are two stories. I think they're both useful. And let's sort of take them in turn. All right. The first thing I want you to think about when you study the West is to think about the West as a place. The geography of the American West is unique. You see, the East is heavily, it's forested, it's adequate for rainfall, agriculture, but there's a solid kind of line here that moves across the map. And beyond this line, the West gets less than 20 inches of rain a year, and without extensive agriculture is really not suitable for much. And this is why in the pre-Civil War America, it was called the Great American Desert. And yes, out here in the far coast, this could be an agricultural paradise, the Willamette Valley here where Portland Beach is pretty amazing. There are amazing valleys that grow, on my mind, some of the finest avocados in the world. But largely speaking, the West is a fairly barren place, and it's settled in a unique way. So the Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis really lays out this idea that the West is not just a place. It's a process. It's a process by which development takes on this line. And so the frontier moves. It moves from kind of generation to generation as the nation moves westward. So the frontier moves westward. And there's something that happens to individuals along this line. They become something other than what they were. And so Jackson tells lots of stories of particular kind of heroic figures, of miners who work the land, who kind of draw gold and silver and copper out of the land without any real assistance from the federal government. So he sort of makes heroes of this rugged individualism. Critics of Turner, and there are many, point out that within Turner's story then, there are lots of voices that are forgotten. So yes, you have individualistic sort of miners here panning for gold. But people who study the West often don't talk about the large-scale Asian immigration into the American West. So when you imagine the rugged individual in the West, don't just imagine a white man. Imagine a Chinese American miner. When you think about rail splitting in the American West as sort of the Lincoln on the frontier as the image of democracy, or you think about pioneers kind of getting in their Conestoga wagon and moving out to Oregon, you also should imagine kind of the desolation of the West. The pioneers who move out into what you're seeing here is the scene of a Nebraska sod house in which there were no trees. So people moved out into the wilderness and settled there really without much assistance. And they found it incredibly difficult and desolate. When you think about stories of the West, you think about the Buffalo Soldiers, which were African-American cavalrymen who enlisted after the war, frankly, to get out of the South. and to find opportunity for themselves in the West. Half of the cavalry regiments in the West are Black. Do you imagine their stories as being part of your rugged individualism in the West? Half of the regiments that actually fight in the Spanish-American War are Black, but they're all Black segregated regiments. Their stories are largely kind of invisible. And when you think about stories of the West, what do you think about the Native Americans? So I like Turner's idea tremendously, this idea that we get our democratic character from the West. But you have to ask yourself if this is really true. What happens to the Native Americans on the frontier, right? The Civil War is ironically not a source of great opportunity for them. The Federal Army generally comes east, and so fighting immediately breaks out in the 1860s on the frontier between the settlers who want to move into land that had been promised to the Lakota Sioux on the Great Plains. And I think the Civil War, I mean, if it makes us realistic, it makes us gritty, it makes us certain in our own triumph. It pushes us to move into the West pretty confident of who we think we are. So you think about the stories of, sorry, I'm trying to get the right page in the answer. You think about kind of the, why is there conflict in the American West? Is that a fundamental part of our story? It had been hoped, you can see the reservations there in the aftermath of the Civil War, that the Sioux could be moved west of the Missouri River and they could be out there and that they would be untroubled there. And then what happens in the following years in 1877 at the end of Reconstruction is that gold is discovered out in the Black Hills in the far western part of South Dakota. And in gross violation of the treaty, thousands of settlers moved in there. They're seemingly unstoppable. The government doesn't have much of a sense that anything can be done to stop them. And the General Custer, who'd been a kind of a Civil War cavalry hero, leads a detachment of the army out into Montana to deal with the Sioux who won't come into the reservation. They're ordered to disperse because they're hunting outside of their territory in violation of the treaty. And it was really a pretty stunning moment in Western history. General Custer is surrounded. He's got about 250 cavalry. He's surrounded by about 10,000 Lakota Sioux warriors, and his forces are killed to a man. And this is a sort of stunning moment in American history. News of this sort of has to travel by messenger back towards St. Louis. It picks up the telegraph. It's wired instantly to Philadelphia. News happens to arrive in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1876, as part of sort of the bicentennial celebration of America. And it sort of comes as a psychic shock. People hadn't expected this. They thought the natives must sort of be brought to heel. And so even though this is a great victory for the Native Americans, they sort of engaged in no real kind of follow-up plan. They dispersed, and so then the major tribes, the Nez Perce, the Apache, the Sioux, were all captured. They're largely put on reservation. And the government sort of seems to have a sense that this is inevitable, that nothing else could happen, that nothing else sort of would come of this. And when you think about the technological disparities, I mean, there's a sense in which that's true. The government has telegraphs. They have swarms of settlers and miners that are pouring across the West without any real legality. They have the machine gun. They have the advantage of like epidemic resistance. In large part, there's also sort of the demise of the Native American is tightly linked to the buffalo. So in the 1750s, there had been 30 million buffalo kind of riding on the Great Plains. And in 1750s, the natives get horses from the Comanche to the south, which changes the whole nature of freedom for the tribes on the Great Plains. I've listened anyway, the stories told by Lakota Sioux historians, and they talk about the Great American, this is sort of the golden age of the Native American between 1750 and 1850. Smallpox comes through fairly quickly before they meet the white men, and so the tribes are devastated then. And then they gain horses, and then they gain some access to firearms, and so there are 10 or 15,000 of them out on the Great Plains. And look at what happens to the buffalo population. I mean, so don't romanticize the Native Americans. They're hunting the buffalo down pretty aggressively. But then what the natives had done in a century, then white people complete really in the space of about 10 years with the railroad. They engage in these parties, these hunting parties go west on the railroads and shoot the bison down to about a few hundred. They nearly drive them to extinction. In other places, land that had sort of allotted for Native Americans, is sort of gradually taken away. You can see, and it's not so much that it's taken away by the government. The government really just refuses to enforce treaty rights as the law on the rest of its citizens. And so this is a case of just horrific neglect. And you see that in the Chief Joseph piece I had you read. The culmination of government policy comes in the Dawes Act of 1887. In the Dawes Act, the natives are sort of told, we're going to move you off of the reservation system, and we're going to replace it with a system of private property, allowing take all of the reservation and give every family so many acres and allow them to sort of do what they want, make them into and give them the same rights as other Americans. But it's a system that's almost designed to create abuse and neglect. Every family is supposed to get 160 acres to farm, which is what would have been given to the homesteaders. But this is not how the natives lived, and many of these parcels are out in the far west where they get less than 20 acres of rain a year, and they're not suitable for that kind of agriculture. The better land is generally bought up by white settlers, and the other land that the natives remain on is generally land that the white settlers aren't interested in. Spiritual and kind of cultural resistance groups form, but they're pretty far weakened on the reservations. Then the sort of culture of defeatism and dependency emerges, where the people who stay there sort of look for either the tribe or the government to provide for them. And the government does a really lousy job. I mean, the Native American Bureau is the place where drunks and incompetents go if you're looking for a federal job. And it's generally considered by historians to be the most managed agency in American history. The difficulty culminates in the Wounded Knee Massacre, when a group of natives try to make for the Canadian border, where they hear that things are better up there, and they're caught by US soldiers, and gunfire opens up and cut down. So this is a pretty bleak chapter in American history. I tell it not because I want to make it the defining aspect of late American history. I tell it in part because I think you're getting a lot of hope stories from the textbook. And my sense is that this is a story that the textbook doesn't tell especially well. It's a story that Americans were largely ignorant of. There are a few voices like Helen Hunt Jackson, who writes an expose, you could say that she's an early breaker, called The Century of Dishonor, talking about Native American policy toward the Indian. But generally speaking, what the liberals wanted was to sort of give the Native Americans the same rights as white society, and to allow them to be cast into kind of this great fray of capitalism and competition. What the less liberal forces wanted were folks like William Tecumseh Sherman, reputed to have said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Although Sherman said so much, he's quoted as saying so much, that no doubt there are other kind of countervailing quotes where Sherman said something. That's Western history in a nutshell. It's a sort of romantic story, and it becomes significant particularly for folks at the end of the 19th century, because they feel like this is a romantic story that's coming to an end. Henry Lloyd Demarest is quoted as kind of saying that, well, I mean, to back it up a little bit, Horace Greeley is sort of this great American newspaper editor for Civil War times. In 1844, he writes, "Go West, young man, grow up with your country, that this is the place where American adolescence is going to be defined." And in the 1880s, Henry Lloyd Demarest says, yeah, Americans can no longer go west. They must go up or down. So that's a key part of Frederick Jackson Turner's insight. When he writes The Frontier in the 1890s, he's observing that this part of our story is over, that there is really no more frontier anymore, that everywhere is settled, that everywhere, every region in America has more than 2 persons per square mile. And that cities are emerging and railroads are. America of the future is going to be defined by capitalism and not democracy, and not maybe the frontier. And that's a tragic story for many Americans, because this capitalism story is a story of opportunity, but it seems like it's a story of conflict. One of the things that, at least for white Americans, the hope of the West was that anyone could go west and seek opportunity for themselves. You could be a poor Irish immigrant, you could be a Scandinavian farmer, you could be an African American trying to get out of the South, and you could go west and you could seek opportunity, you could make something for yourself. It was a place of possibility, and that was the American story. And to be sure, people look to the city for some of the same things, but it's definitely a source of conflict. So let's turn back to 1877 and look at the story again from the point of view of this year when Reconstruction. The year 1877 is a year of profound labor violence in American history. It's not just the end of Reconstruction. There was a dramatic railroad strike that posed common workers against the power of industrial barons. In the mid-1870s, there'd been a depression, not especially long, but sharper probably than the 2008 depression that most of you experienced early teens. And thousands of people are laid off and lose their jobs. In July of 1877, the workers on the walked out to protest the pay cut. The strikers in those days proposed more radical solutions than I think they're wont to do today. They not only walked out, but they shut down the railroads all over the country. They destroyed company property. And the American people, at least the urban people, sort of picked the side of the strikers railroad. And the middle class is actually, they're frightened. Pittsburgh newspaper writes in 77, this may be the beginning of a great civil war in this country between labor and capital. We've had a North versus South. Now maybe it's time for the class war that Marx has been predicting, that we're terrified of. But as the strike spreads nationally, remember it starts in Baltimore, goes all the way to San Francisco, it's put down by federal troops. In Pittsburgh, 26 lives are lost in this confrontation between U.S. soldiers and kind of workers. The strikes did major damage to the railroads. They destroyed 50 miles of rail in Pittsburgh alone. But by 1878, the economy is booming again. The threat of a French-style communist uprising had passed, and faith in the prosperity of Americans had been restored. The undercurrent of concern remained, and this is sort of a lurking fear, I think, for the next 40 years in American history, down through World War I. Is there going to be this Russian-style revolution? Now, the Russian Revolution hadn't happened yet, right? And nobody would have predicted it in Russia, but people look to America and Britain as the emerging sort of capitalist giants, as the place where this revolution might take place. We've forgotten this in the aftermath of the war, that there was once this sort of radical America, right? And I'm talking a lot about capitalism. I'm presuming probably too much. So let's think for a sec about what capitalism is. What are the elements that constitute. So first, capitalism is a system of private property. It draws on the ideas of Locke, of that as we add our labor to property, we acquire it and we make it ours. So this is a part of the free labor system Americans had so deeply prior to this. It sees economic production as a moral good, as a moral necessity, and it presupposes that private property really does belong to investors, and so the factories really do belong to the capitalists, and the laborers are sort of given wages for what they deserve. Now we you tend to see this in terms of good and evil. Um, I think if you're from one particular party in America today, you tend to see the capitalist story as a story of enterprise and innovation. And if you're in the other party, you tend to see it as a story of class conflict and exploitation. I don't think that accurately describes politics in the late 19th century. I think both parties embrace capitalism. They have different senses of what capitalism ought to look like. One party is a little more agrarian, a little more working class, the Democrats, but both parties sort of embrace this system as a necessity. And it's only under as capitalism pressure that you see opposition mount in other third-party movements like the Populist Party, essentially Bryan's populist campaign for the Democratic nomination in '96. So by the end of the century, you're seeing a new movement. I want you to have a sense of just like how central this story is to the dominance of American economic power by 1900, even by before 1900. So by 1894, which is right on the cusp of a major kind of economic boom in America, coming out of a recession, the United States had more industrial output than Britain, France, and Germany combined. Now, that doesn't mean they're a military power. It doesn't even mean that they're a financial power, because many of these factories are kind of in companies owned by British and French and German investors. But the production is in the United States. Within 20 years, the number of goods in this economy had tripled. So America is not only bigger than the other three powers, but they're growing more quickly. And by World War I, the US produces a third of the world's industrial output. Now that's sort of the foundation for the American century that we'll spend a lot of the rest of the semester talking about. And so how is it that this takes place, right? In this roughly 30 years that we're talking about this I guess it's this morning for you, you see a doubling of the American population. Some of that's driven by immigration, but this is a space in which, under sort of Whiggish economic policy and this idea of a nation of mechanics and farmers, farm output triples as the population doubles, which allows this large, what Hofstadter says, America's born in the country and moves to the city. So millions of Americans and millions of kind of rural people from all over the world, from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia, and Italy, also move into American factory cities. And so the value of American manufactured goods grows by 6 times, adjusted for inflation. Now, when the quantity of goods increases that dramatically, it means, if you know about the laws of supply and demand, that prices crash. So this is actually a set of decades of price deflation in America, not price inflation. There had been 25% inflation during the war as a result of kind of Civil War kind of overspending. And in the next 30 years, there's sort of a pull down in prices. And because the factory jobs actually pay all right, especially if you're an engineer, especially if you're middle class. People in America experience this as a rise in real income. So except in Depression years, the American people are fairly happy with this system because they see a rise in real income. So, in terms of your purchasing power for your dollar, your average person's getting $3.38 in 1877. By 1900, they can buy $573 worth of goods. They're making a little more. Their dollar goes a lot further. Now, the question of why does this happen is a really interesting one. It's a pretty complicated one. Some of it has to do with just the rapid growth and scale of the economy. There had been sort of an international cotton economy before the Civil War, but the railroad really makes possible the complete integration of the entire nation into one unified economy. So think about a place like Houghton. Before the Civil War, there's a canal that kind of goes up and down the Genesee, and we're integrated into the economy. But by the 1880s, virtually everywhere in America is connected the way that we're connected. And the railroad network basically it's a driver of other industries. And so the creation of rolling stock, and locomotives, trains, and sleeping cars, and then the steel and the coal, and just like the automobile in the 20th century, the railroad in the 18th century sort of drives the economy. honesty sort of forces me to admit that this isn't an entirely kind of laissez-faire capitalist story. I mean, the Western railroads are largely built, remember, with kind of Hamiltonian style land grants to the railroads. Where for every mile that the railroad built across the West, they'd be granted a right of way a mile on either side, which is a heck of a lot of land in the West. And it's land that's right next to the railroad, so it suddenly becomes economically valuable. Um, there are also sort of increases in efficiency that come with it. The standardization of railroads sort of requires blocks in a minute so that the trains run on. So instead of every town have their particular time. Not sure if you thought much about this, but in 19th century America, every town sort of has a clock and they set their own time. And then when the railroads come in, you move to a time zone system where every kind of zone in America lives on standardized time. And it's this mechanization and sort of this discipline. Um, with the railroads also come these sort of these stories that people will either call kind of titans of industry, or we could call them robber barons, depending on whether you see them as being good or ill. One of my favorite kind of characters from this time period is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt actually comes from New York City. He was a steamboat captain back in the early 19th century. His steamboats are actually part of the case that drives the Gibbons v. Ogden, the famous Supreme Court case about interstate commerce. Vanderbilt made enough money as a steamboat captain, but by the 1830s, he was investing in his own railroad. And he was able to take the proceeds from his enterprise and bought a series of unconnected railroads that went from New York up to Albany and then out to Buffalo, called the New York Central. And he really did the public a service by building it. All of these little railroads aren't individually worth all that much. I mean, you could get from Rochester to Syracuse and then from Syracuse to Albany, but if you had to ride on 3 different railroads and change trains in every city, it would take days. Cornelius makes it possible to travel across the state in a day, which is an impressive feat. And he's doing a real service. But there were other businessmen that seem less interested in doing good and more than just kind of getting rich. I think Vanderbilt does both, frankly. Vanderbilt also sort of becomes famous as the standard of American wealth. He uses his wealth to build this enormous ballroom right in New York City. And every year he sends out 400 invitations to the ball. So the 400 were the social elite in New York City. And it's a sign that America's really changing. I mean, so the old kind of Roosevelt family and the old Edwards family and the old Burr family, the people who had been the sort of elite of America, are no longer really the elite. And it's this nouveau riche, people without the education and degrees who are sort of taking the lead in America and kind of they're the governing families. And they still have some influence. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but Anderson Cooper, who is a kind of a talking head on CNN, is actually the descendant of Cornelius Vanderbilt. I think he's 4 or 5 generations removed. So their heirs are still around and they're still culturally significant. Although defenders of capitalism would point out that they don't actually have the kind of longevity. Most of these very, very rich people, their grandchildren sort of become major cultural figures or major patrons of arts, which, Anderson Cooper's mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, was certainly a patron of the arts. But you don't see this sort of people who dominate the economy year over year over year very much. And then there are these unscrupulous guys. Jay Gould is a robber baron, as he was known. He's famous for buying up rundown railroads and then sort of magically making them turn a profit. He buys up the Union Pacific after it had built the Transcontinental Railroad, and then turned out that the Union Pacific wasn't making very much money. Wanted to travel all over the small towns in the West. There was a lot of money to be made building the railroad, and then running it not so much. Buys it up, and then spends money on improvements. He paints the train station. He puts new seat cushions in the trains. He makes it look pretty, and investors are happy. And he starts paying really high dividends, and so people sort of become, oh, he's turned the company around. What they don't realize is under the surface, Jay Gould is sort of looting the company for everything it's worth. He's taking all of its rolling stock, taking all of its enterprises, um, and then having driven up the stock price, he sells it at a profit, and the new investors discover that it's essentially worthless. He does this, I think, 3 times. After he's done it 3 times, everyone sort of recognizes, don't buy a Gould company. It's not worth anything. But he's worth $100 million when he dies. And by 1900, because of men like Vanderbilt and Gould, there are 7 major railroad groups that control 2/3 of the rail lines of the United States, especially if you're moving across the American West, right? There's a line that a banker named J.P. Morgan controls, and there might be a line that Vanderbilt controls. And they essentially had monopolies in lots of major American cities. That might not be as true in a place like Buffalo, but if you were in Salt Lake or you were in Denver or you lived in Portland, I mean, really, it was a one railroad town, and you sort of had to live with that. So in terms of the gains made by manufacturing, what you see happen in railroads happens in most other major American cities. You see a consolidation, so where in 1870s, there's sort of cutthroat capitalism and massive competition. By about 1900, power has been collected in the hands of a very few successful businessmen, and they have so much market share that it becomes virtually impossible to break in. In 1900, no one has the capacity to found a railroad. There are no more railroad entrepreneurs. And so the collection of leaders sort of form what they call a cartel, where they can collectively meet together in some kind of smoke-filled boardroom and set prices for the rest of the country. Now, railroads are in fair competition with each other. So if you're trying to get on the coast-to-coast route, you're fine. But in most cases, most local places like Houghton, I mean, there would have been only one railroad into Houghton, and we would have paid the rates that they charge. And if you wanted to get up to Rochester and you were a farmer and wanted to get your grain up to Rochester, you would charge what the railroad wanted you to pay. And there would be any way around that. Now, that's becoming true in the 1890s for the vast majority of industries, right? We could talk about nails, we could talk about oil, but let's talk about meatpacking, because it sort of gives another example of kind of how industrialism works outside the transportation industry. So meatpacking was once something that was done intensely locally, right? People like meat, Americans like fresh steak. You can't really ship it long distances before the development of these refrigerator cars. And for most towns, slaughterhouse, it would happen on the east side of town. So as the western wind blew in, it was sort of blow the stench away from town. But there would be a local butcher who did most of the work on site. And so when you bought meat, it was fresh and you knew who was doing it. And if you had an issue with it, it would, right? So what happens, and steaks are fairly expensive because they're, the prices are, the industry is too small to really economize. What do you do with all the bones if you're a local butcher? Well, you might sell them for soup, but you can't do that much with them. And there's only so much that people want. And the labor costs are pretty high because it's a specialized kind of industry. You might be a couple butchers and have to train for years to be able to. What happens when meatpacking industrializes? I don't know if you've ever been to a meatpacking plant. In fact, I hope you've never been to a meatpacking plant. It'll make you not want to eat meat for a long time. When I was your age, I worked for a smokehouse at a little place in Vermont. And I actually got to see how the sausage got made. I worked, sometimes I would work kind of delivering meat scraps to the sausage makers, and sometimes I would work on the bacon cutting line. And it was a pretty horrifying thing. I mean, it took about 3 years before I could eat sausage again. Kind of like sausage, so I got back to it, but it took a while. It's basically it's an assembly line process. So the animal goes in one side. Almost all the animal gets used. They figure out how to use the bones to make certain kinds of things and the hides to make certain kinds of things. And because everything gets used, they're able to drive costs down. This does make meat more expensive, more efficient. So this might be a good thing. I don't know, for the consumer. American factory workers certainly eat more meat than British factory workers do, or German factory workers do. So it's good for our standard of living. But having sort of consolidated the actual meat processing, the meat packers want to figure out how to make profits. So they developed this process called vertical integration. Vertical integration is the process by which you have a factory. So how do you figure out how to take more profits than you can just get within kind of making the meat less expensive? Well, you want to go both directions. You want to go chase the supply of meat, and then you also want to chase the consumer. So Swift and Armour were meatpacking facilities in Chicago. Chicago quickly becomes the beef processing center of the country. And they used the railroads to bring it in. So instead of having these kind of epic Western cattle drives from Texas, driving them up, you run the railroad line straight into Texas and you send company buyers in, and then you would buy directly from the cowboys and you would put them on a cattle car and you would take them to the factory. So now you've cut out a whole host of middlemen. And then you dress the meat and you produce steaks or whatever, or bacon in this case. And then you put it in a refrigerator car that you own and you send it all over America. And so today what we do is if you go to the market, well, I used to call it the market packet, or is the stop and save. My wife and I wanted to call it the stop and save. The prices there, but the little grocery store up in Fillmore, if you go there, what you'll discover is that the meat's not local. It probably comes from Chicago, or it probably comes from somewhere nationally. That does mean that everything is like less expensive than it would be. But think about what that does to the economy, right? So what does that do to all the local butchers? What does that do to the local slaughterhouse? Well, it puts it all out of business. This capitalism creates a huge amount of economic dislocation, or what Austrian economists like to call creative destruction. It's probably good for the consumer, but it does mean that economic power starts to consolidate in the hands of the few. And by 1900, there isn't actually a lot of competition. So 5 of these meat packers basically control the American meat market, and they can set the price on steak if they want. They do it. So prices have been driving down dramatically, but in the mid 1890s, they start to go back up. And it's largely because of this monopolization. That becomes a major kind of critique that reformers level at monopoly. It's become a major part of the progressive movement. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's part of the kind of the development in the economy. You see this drive toward advertising, right? If you have your local butcher and you know him, he doesn't really need to advertise, right? Not in a place like Houghton. But if you're not buying your cornflakes locally, then you sort of need to think about, you need to be told what to consume, right? So middle class consumers all over, advertising starts to become a new industry. And it becomes a way in which kind of the public can be told what they need. Social critics are a bit nervous about it, but I think it's part of capitalism, right? Now, we could do this in a whole host of other areas. I want to move super fast. There's a level of innovation that comes with it, right? So the barbed wire, Edison's inventing the phonograph and the light bulb, Bell is inventing the telephone. The steel industry sort of explodes out of nowhere and takes Andrew Carnegie to tremendous wealth. I mean, the textbook's good on Carnegie. I'm just going to skip right over Carnegie. Carnegie is one of these figures, though, that's sort of this both and. He's both an enormous philanthropist who gives away hundreds of millions of dollars to sort of do good. He's a good example of a capitalist. But how does he get rich? Well, he drives prices down by lowering production costs, which means he's paying his workers less. He's a management genius, but he really doesn't apologize for controlling all of his wealth because he thinks he's going to do a better job of using it for the good of the public than the worker, right? He has the capacity to give away $100 million, he'd say, to build libraries, and the worker doesn't. Rockefeller is another thing that your textbook does a nice job on. Rockefeller, though, doesn't simply do vertical integration, right? Rockefeller does the same thing that the meat packers did. He bought, oil fields and refineries and cars, gas stations. Rockefeller takes this to another level. Rockefeller does horizontal integration. He begins to buy all of the oil refineries in America. And what made Rockefeller so impressive was not just that he became enormously rich, he did, but he essentially controlled the American kerosene market. This isn't a cartel. This is just Rockefeller. He alone will control at the end 95% of kerosene refining in America. And he creates then in every state that he wants to sell kerosene, a Standard Oil company that's controlled by an interlocking board of directors, that the people who control all of these companies sit on one center company called the Standard Oil Trust, and he controls the Standard Oil Trust. And that level of power makes him very difficult to resist. So he sort of becomes the boogeyman for capitalism. Another really influential capitalist is a both Carnegie and Rockefeller have, they could be praised, I think, by many Americans because they represent kind of rags to riches stories. Stories like the Horatio Alger story I had you take a look at. There's this deep belief in Americans that America is the kind of place where little boys like Dick and young men like Andrew Carnegie can come from nothing. They can be immigrants. They can live in poverty. Andrew Carnegie is actually an orphan, and they have this ability to rise to tremendous wealth. Well, J.P. Morgan is not that actually. He's from a very wealthy family of London bakers. He goes to boarding schools. He has enormous power in the American economy, in large part because people invest in Morgan invest in banks. So the money is his and it's his family's, but a large amount of the money that he controls is actually cash that the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Drews kind of put. And so he then has this enormous pool of capital that he can then help to create major new American corporations. So classic example of this is in 1901, when Andrew Carnegie wants to sell his Carnegie Steel. It's probably worth half a billion dollars on paper. There's no one to buy it, right? He owns the company outright. Who's actually? What are you gonna do? So J.P. Morgan actually approaches him and asks him if he's interested in selling. And Morgan, even though he's not personally worth that much, he can raise that much, and he puts together enough money, and then he buys half a dozen other steel companies and combines all of them into U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel is the first billion-dollar corporation. And he begins to sell the stock on Wall Street, which sort of takes this large company public and allows Americans to participate. And that's sort of the direction that American capitalism moves in the 20th century, right? So that it's a little more investor-driven, it's a little more democratic. But Carnegie himself, Morgan then himself becomes this enormously influential figure. There's a moment, I forget if it's 1904 or 1905, when there's a collapse in the gold market in America. This is such a different world than what we live in today. Right now we're debating kind of a stimulus in 2020 to help us kind of recover from the coronavirus, and the federal government's thinking of injecting $2 trillion into the economy. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't have anything like that, and he's concerned about all of the gold leaving America and going to Britain. So he goes to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan basically saves the American market. He buys so much gold and then sells it and uses it. He brings gold from England back to America, and kind of injects liquidity into American markets, saves us from a crash. Now, what does this mean for the American working class? I think we should ask. The American working class doesn't seem all that interested in the radical ideas that the European working class does. How does the rise of big business affect the working classes? Well, a large number of the working classes in America are now immigrants. They're coming in from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. They're largely Catholics and Jews. They're quite a bit different than the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who've run the country for 150 years. But they're coming, I think, because they're seeking this opportunity that's in America. I'm really enchanted by this autobiography that Mary Antin writes about. Mary Antin is a kind of a Polish Jew who comes to America. Her biography is called The Promised Land, if you want to read it. And she writes that when she moved to Boston, how wonderful everything was, that everything was free, that the electricity, that the lights were free, and that the schools were free. And she wrote that in America, she gets to dream her dreams. and that, although there was a lot of kind of, there were problems for the working class, but that this is a place where there was opportunity. And I think that opportunity means that American laborers don't feel trapped in the same way that Europeans do. So while European laborers are turning towards socialism, American workers don't. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't labor violence in America. Workers could be pretty hard and bare-knuckled about their tactics. The fellow that you're looking at here is a cigar maker named Samuel Gompers, right? Gompers creates an organization called the American Federation. It's a collection of skilled workers. But he's pretty ruthless about not letting just anyone in. He wants a union. So he's a cigar maker. Cigar making is kind of artisanal work. If you're a cigar maker, you're allowed to join his union. If you're a steel worker, making steel requires experience. It's risky. You expect high wages. So he'll let people like this into his union. And then when he goes on strike, as skilled workers, the capitalists found them very difficult to replace. So the American labor tradition, as it develops, favors strikes, it favors boycotts, but it tends not to look toward political violence, at least as that might be a tactic, but not as the ultimate outcome of its strikes. So I think I'm going to call the lecture there. I wanted to talk more about the American city. Maybe in 2 days I can run a mini lecture on the American city, and we can use that sort of in conjunction with what's coming next. So on Friday, what I'd like to do is have you read as much as you can of this, The Plunket of Tammany Hall. It's by William Reardon. It's the Plunket of Tammany Hall is a story about a political machine in America. It's one of my favorite kind of books in American history. I know when Dr. Okerson taught here, it was really a staple in his curriculum. It's an ironic text. And as modern students, I think you might have the capacity to read it, but what Reardon does, he's a journalist. It's his goal to make George Washington Plunket look bad, to make him look corrupt. And so what he's done is he's collected a set of speeches and interviews that Plunket has given. Plunket runs this political machine in New York City called Tammany Hall. And he's basically organized all of the votes of all of the immigrants in Tammany, in New York, and he gets them to vote in blocks, and it gives him enormous power over city government and over state government. He has power that he can dispense in exchange for favors. So if you want something done in New York City, you might not ask the governor, you might not ask the mayor, you might just cut right to the chase and ask George Washington Plunket. Now, Plunket thinks this is good, defends what he calls honest graft. So that'll be my first question for you on Friday. I'll kind of say, well, what do you think about Plunket? What do you think about honest graft? And I really want you to kind of get both sides of the story. So take Plunket's defense of himself seriously. Is this the best way to get work done in the city? Or is, as Reardon is trying to suggest, this is an incredibly corrupt way to do politics, and we ought to have a political reform that not only cleans up, say, corporate power over meat packing. Maybe we need something like the Food and Drug Administration to kind of keep track of our meat supply. Maybe we also need to kind of deal with consolidation of political power in the American city. So read it, tell me what you think. Next week, I'd like to have a short paper in which you do an analysis of how the political machine works. But I assure you, before your paper's due, we'll cover both a discussion of it, and then I'll try to do some things to explain the city and the problems of the city and immigration and how those things work, maybe as part of our discussion on Friday. So you'll be able to see a link. Let me show you where that is. So I'm going to share with you briefly. This is my this is what your actually no, this is humanities, right? This is what your Moodle page looks like, right? Right here on your Moodle page, you'll see a link for a synchronous discussion that I'm planning to run on Friday. and you'll find it under where I'm about to put the lecture link. All right. You can always email me if you have questions, or tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I plan to be available if you need to chat with me, want to run a live discussion about something. All right. I hope you have a good week. This has been a pretty crazy transition for all of us. This is certainly not the way I like education. I'm sort of sitting here with my cup of tea. I would much rather be sort of listening to Isaiah interject, and I'd listening to thoughtful questions from Cheyenne. And yeah, I miss you all. And hopefully we'll all be back in the fall, and we'll be willing to move forward and learn some more. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll look forward to talking to you on Friday.